All right, hi everyone. I'm Shy. I'm really excited to get to talk to you. A little late, but that's okay. I think that's probably in everyone's best interest. It's pretty early in New York. I woke up extra early just for the talk. I normally am not up this early on a Sunday, so I've had more time to let the coffee settle. So I think it's probably pretty good that we got a little delayed. Um, I'm a developer evangelistic contentful. I've been there for a while, so I get to work on building examples and tutorials that show what contentful does and just kind of exploring all sorts of interesting technology use cases. So I'm here to talk to you about static websites today. And I think any good talk about static sites is really kind of a history lecture. And it's a brief kind of look back and reflection of like what the internet used to be like. So I don't know if anyone that's watching was around and actively using the internet in 1991. If you were, you're probably a badass because you were probably working at CERN or really high up in the computer science department at a university. But the first original website actually was put out by CERN in August 6th of 1991. This website is actually still live. You can go check it out at info.cern.ch and kind of see how it looks. And it's a really interesting website because back then every single website was static. We didn't have things like layout. It was pretty much you put stuff in and it would go vertically. If you wanted to do link management, it was you doing manual A tags. And if you think back to 91, the internet speed back then was 1.2 kilobytes per second, which is the point where I don't want to use the internet anymore. If things are that slow, I'm calling it. I'm out. So I'm going to go back to the library to find information at that point. And the architecture stack was really simple back then. Largely, it was a developer would push some code out to a workstation, or they would make some code on their computer on a workstation. They would toss that code up on a web server, and then when your browser wanted to, connect to the internet, it would ping the web server, and then the web server would just send the static file back. The web server didn't really do much beyond, handle routing and kind of sending these static files. So the internet starts to get more interesting as time goes on. We start to get the first web search, which is AliWeb, that was announced in 1993, and it gets published in May of 94. The first web comic shows up around the end of 93 in December. And we start to get more interesting technologies. So we get Common Gateway around 94. Rasmus Lerdorf releases his personal homepage tools in 95. We start to see things like Perl in 94. JavaScript starts coming out around then as well. We get the original prototype in 95. And the internet jumps up to 28 kilobytes a second, which is still too slow for me to be willing to use it. So if you put me in a time machine back to 94, I will be still going to the library. And the architecture model of what tech looks like and what websites look like, it gets a little more interesting now. Now we start to see things like databases. So the web server starts communicating to this thing and starts building pages dynamically and then sending those dynamically created pages out to the client. So you get to be able to do things like e-commerce. So we get Amazon showing up in 1994. PayPal comes up around this time as well in 1994. And as like revenue and money starts to become possible on the internet, we start to see kind of things evolve into a business. We start to see more kind of support. So things like ASP and SunJSP pop up in 96 and 99. We start to see dynamic CMSs, things like WordPress coming up. We start to see a lot of tooling getting supported. So things like Dreamweaver and Front Page, and the internet gets to 56 kilobytes per second. And I think the most important thing that happens in this period is actually the introduction of a new person to, kind of building the website. Previously, website dev has been like the realm of just developers. And we start to see editorial teams jump in. So now we have these non-technical folks that need to edit content and need to make changes and bold stuff. And we start to see things like source control popping up. And so CVS, I think, shows up around then, and Subversion shows up some point after that. And so the architecture model has these non-technical folks that will communicate with the application server, and we start to see, WYSIWYG editors and stuff like that. WordPress pops up in 2003. MySpace pops up in 2004. I start to use the internet and make a Zynga profile in 2005. And we have all sorts of fun kind of ways for you to customize the internet and really, develop your own kind of presence in it. And we start to see more dynamic applications. So things like Google Maps pop out in 2005, Rightly, which is one of the original blogging platforms, comes up at the end of 2005 and gets bought out by Google and then shut down in 2006. And the actual spec as a developer, like the tooling that we get to use, gets more exciting as well. So, things like XML HTTP requests, SPA, jQuery comes up in 2006, Angular comes out in 2009, and we start to see like 8 megabyte per second speeds in 2006, which is a point where I consider internet kind of acceptable, but I'm not happy about it. And like, this is really cool, but unfortunately this has kind of taken us really, really far away from that static model of like, the web server not really doing any thinking and just sending static files out to the browser. Sites at this point are very dynamic. They have to talk to a lot of different things before you get to render that page. And so modern static sites kind of start to have a comeback around this period. And I think largely one of the biggest reasons for this is actually GitHub. So GitHub starts in 2008, and one of their original projects is GitHub Pages. So GitHub Pages is this really great tool that's actually still around, and it uses a Ruby-based static site generator called Jekyll. So they have their own version of Jekyll running over on GitHub. So you can't install any custom plugins or anything like that. But essentially what you do is you commit to your source control management, and then GitHub will build the website. It'll take a look and it'll poop out some static files, and then they'll host it for you on a GitHub domain, which you can hook up to a custom domain if you want. And so, some of my original websites were actually done using this back when I was still learning to code. So I think Jekyll's a really interesting tool, but it's really sluggish and really slow. The architecture model of it is pretty chill, though. It's a developer talking to source control. Source control triggers a build, and then when that build is done, the statically hosted code gets pushed out onto like an edge host, kind of a host that's prioritizing static delivery, and that's able to communicate straight to the browser. And yeah, editors sometimes are able to kind of jump in here, but I think the expectation of editors kind of doing Git or GitHub is a little rough. They're not necessarily ones to enjoy it. I think editors kind of need some sort of GUI, but they can be part of this process. They just aren't necessarily always part of it. And I've been talking about static sites, and I guess I really should kind of dive into some of the positives of them, because you're only delivering static files, static HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It really reduces the vector for security. There isn't really a database to attack, or, you're not doing anything dynamically. There's not a ton of communication with the server. So the attack vector of a static site is a lot smaller than a traditional dynamic site. The performance is really great because all the web server is doing is being like, what file should I send you? Okay, here's the file. And the web server doesn't really need to do any thinking, so you don't have to wait. You get to lose, that time spent on page rendering. The caching is really easy since every file is the same. You can just use some really trivial like logic to hook things up to a CDN. And the maintenance is really easy as well because it's just static files. And there are a lot of really great static site generators out there. Things like Gatsby, Hugo, I think comes out in 2013, Metalsmith in 2014, Middleman in 2009, Hexio in 2012. And for the purpose of this talk, the one that I really want to kind of share is actually Flask Frozen Flask. I'm a really big fan of this library. Fair warning, it's a little underutilized. It's seen some commits in the last couple of months, but prior to that, there was a big gap. And the last time that it had some folks poking at it was in 2017. That said, I think it's still really great. If you have a lot of familiarity with Flask and you want to kind of get around with experimenting with static sites for the first time, I think it's a really great place to get started and to try things out. I really like how it works, and I I think I've got enough time to actually dig through some code for a little bit. So I'm going to pull up this repo. This is the adulting.dev website, and the repo's up at github.com/adulting-dev/adulting.dev. This is just a little conference website. I run a small conference here in New York for non-technical folk, or for technical folks to learn kind of the non-technical skills to be successful. So this is a fairly, I think, basic Flask site, and I think it does a really good job of showcasing the power of Flask Frozen. So I've got, all my imports and stuff, and then it's just a single route here. It's a single route to a home page. I have it running via the standard, kind of Python app.py on port 5000. So if we take a look over to port 5000, we can see that, it's a pretty basic website. It's a one-pager. And where Flask Frozen comes in is we're able to kind of jump and create this single line freeze file. So what this freeze file does is it takes a look, it creates this instance of freezer, and then it freezes the site. And what that will do is it'll take a look at the app and be like, okay, where are all my routes? And it'll poop out a static kind of a build directory. And Flask Frozen owns this build directory, so it'll overwrite that directory as needed. And so we can do Python freeze. It'll go ahead and freeze the directory. So we have this build directory now, and we'll have, our static index and all of that. And then we can just do the traditional, Python M. And I think it's, let me see if I have it in my, I always mix up the Python 2 version of simple HTTP server and the Python 3 version of simple HTTP server. There we go, that's the one. So we'll boost this up, and this is kind of Python's very basic, like, let's run a web server version. And so if we take a look at 8000, we've got our site, and it's still running. And so you're able to take this freezer function and apply it as well. Now, there are a couple of use cases that you might be thinking, like, this is pretty cool, this is pretty fast, it's pretty basic though. What if I have a project that's complex? If I have a bunch of different things that I need to do, and I think, static sites just aren't the right fit for this. And some of the use cases that I hear a lot from people are, our editors, they don't know Git. They need a GUI to be able to do content. They can't do static content. Or, maybe we have a lot of content and we need to do search on that content. Or maybe we need to do a contact form, or we're running an online shop and you can't do e-commerce with static sites. And I hear those concerns, and I raise you cloud services and APIs. I think by combining those with static sites, you're able to get the feel of a dynamic website and really get to have the experience of kind of those more dynamic processes, while also balancing the benefits of having a static site itself. So another history lesson, AWS itself starts in 2002, and we start to get Lambda, so the serverless kind of stuff that AWS is doing these days gets bumped up in 2014. We also start to see REST in 2000, and some really great API focused companies start pumping up around 2007. We get Twilio for texting, and they eventually go on to purchase SendGrid, and then we get Stripe, which can handle payment processing in 2011. And I'm jumping a lot of names here, and you might be thinking, like, okay, so we can talk to APIs. That still doesn't help us fix the static site problem. And I would argue that actually, it does help. We've got some really great services. And that really enables us to do stuff. So we've got three major points where a static site can interact with a service. So you could do it at build. So the build server reaches out to an API. Maybe it's giving some information. Maybe it's getting some information. Maybe you could reach out via the client on the browser. So a user connects to the website, and then some JavaScript runs locally on their machine to go do something, or we can do something via a function. So, we make a post request from a form, that form triggers a serverless endpoint, and then that endpoint, does some computation, it does some formatting, and reaches out to a service for you. So let's go back to that original kind of complaint that I raised. Our editors don't know Git. They really need a GUI to be successful with our static site. And I think that's totally reasonable. I think that's a really great example of actually Contentful, my employer. So Contentful is a content platform. It provides kind of an editorial interface that non-technical folks can go and, you know, they can type things in, they can create pages, they can bold stuff. Developer is able to define, okay, this is what content is. You know, if you want to create content, this is how you do it. And then the build server will go ahead and it'll build the site, and when it comes time to actually fill in the content, it'll go ahead and it'll reach out to Contentful, and it'll collect that content. It'll figure out what the sitemap is, and it'll build the server for you. That'll, you know, spit out some static HTML and CSS and JavaScript, which will then get pushed over to the static site host. So it's then that really fast connection. And that's actually how the adulting.dev website works, is it reaches out to Contentful and builds the site kind of all on the build server to kind of spit out that static HTML. So the second thing that I brought up was, okay, we have a lot of content. We need to kind of that really organic feeling search in the website. You know, we want to be able to type things in and have the user get autocomplete and spell check and like all that fuzzy kind of text search stuff that makes it feel really powerful. And that's another thing that you can really do fairly easily with static sites. You know, you could use a service like Algolia, which is a really powerful search tool. Your build server can go ahead and provide the content over to Algolia. Algolia will use that to create a search index. And then in the browser, when the user is typing in the search bar, you can have the browser, some, you know, inline JavaScript reaching out to the Algolia service to kind of get that response. So the third case that I brought up was, you know, we need a contact form. Let's say hypothetically that we have a form where people can sign up for a newsletter. So they type their email in, they type their name, and, you know, they say what country they're in. So for example, if they're in Europe, they need a double opt-in. If they're in the US, you don't necessarily need to do that same level of kind of confirmation. So you can do that using serverless. So, you know, and luckily AWS has really phenomenal Python support. They added 3.8 support fairly recently, and the serverless framework itself also supports Python 3.8. So you can be pretty modern with it too. So how you would do it in that kind of architecture model, you would have a browser. The browser would send off a post request. It would hit, you know, the serverless endpoint that you've created. Your Lambda function, or, you know, wherever you're hosting your function, would do some logic. It would say, okay, this is a person from the US, so we're going to trigger an opt-in this way, or this is a person from Europe, so we need to trigger an opt-in this way. And then it would communicate to your email service to kind of manage all of that. Maybe it would hang out and wait for the confirmation. And then if the confirmation comes through, it'll add you to a MailChimp as well. And then the last thing is, let's say we want to run an online shop. We want to do e-commerce, and that's a pretty complicated thing. You know, you need to do things like cart management. You need to do things like checkout. You need to have an ability for people to put credit cards in and pay. And there are a lot of really great vendors that you can work with for e-commerce and static sites. I really like Commerce Layer. I think Commerce Layer is a really powerful static e-commerce shop. So how that works is you have your build server that kind of would manage your products, or maybe would get like a list of products. So maybe you manage all your SKUs in Commerce Layer. That build server would reach out to Commerce Layer and be like, hey, what products are we selling? Let's build pages for all of those dynamically. And then the client would see, okay, hey, you know, these are all my products. I'm going to hit add to cart. That sends some JavaScript to Commerce Layer, and then Commerce Layer as an API is maintaining state in the cart for your customers. So you're able to keep everything static and have like a small dynamic component on the page that renders on the browser kind of end. And then when it comes time for checkout, you know, you're able to punt things over to Stripe and these third-party payment vendors that all have really great, I think, pages and examples of where, you know, they can take over the payment process, and you can do it locally on your actual website, or you can actually redirect it to a Stripe URL where Stripe will handle the transactions. And since it's a Stripe hosted website, you know, they're the ones doing all the security work to make sure that things are secure between you and your customers. And they have some really great tools actually for things like subscription management and stuff like that, where you can just authenticate and then punt it over to Stripe, and Stripe will take care of all the difficult stuff for you, so you don't actually have to code it yourself. And a lot of these APIs actually talk together. They work together really well. So Contentful has a, you know, marketplace where we talk to a lot of these different libraries, and you're able to build these really complicated architectural diagrams where things kind of talk to each other, and you have, all of them working together. And everything is able to kind of trigger its own event. So, if the content changes, it triggers a new build. If the code changes, it triggers a new build. If, you add new products to Commerce Layer, it'll trigger a new build. Anytime a build happens, it triggers an update to Algolia. Anytime a user requests something, it'll get that new search index. And you're able to make these really complicated use cases fairly trivially and fairly simply within that static site kind of world and get all those benefits. So that's it for my talk. I'm right at 20 minutes. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And that code base is adulting.dev as well, if you want to go check it out for like a really practical example that takes advantage of like a lot of third-party APIs as well, but still works in a static site way, and kind of want to dig into it. That's kind of my preferred way to mess with code, is to always dig into it and break it and see what happens. But that's it for me. If anyone has any questions.
I don't really get how you get the current state. For example, you said the content from Contentful will be pushed into your build store. So
yeah,
when you use Flask Frozen, will it initially request all the content and then freeze this content?
Yep, exactly. Exactly. It would do exactly that. And then when an editorial person would update the content, you could use a webhook to your build server. So Netlify is a really, I think, powerful and fairly common static site hosting provider. And so, you hit a publish event on your content provider, or you add a product to your e-commerce platform, and that'll trigger, most of these have webhook support now, and you can have that webhook trigger a new build. So there might be a little bit of a delay if you have a really big content site or something, you could see, a couple minutes waiting. But yeah, it'll trigger a new build, and then it'll invalidate kind of the static site host and replace it with the latest version. And the nice thing here is that if something breaks during this process, because you've already pre-generated all of that static code, it either just doesn't replace the static code, or it's really trivial to revert back to a previous build. Netlify will cache all your old static builds for you. So if an editor breaks something, you can just roll back really, really easily. And that rollback takes seconds, because it's just changing where the static code lives. Yeah, I'm a really big fan of actually still using GitHub Pages for this as well. So GitHub Pages, because they've launched GitHub Actions, now theoretically has support for every static site builder, including Flask Frozen as well. And so if you want to stay exclusively in the GitHub world, that's also an option that's available for you as well, that I like quite a bit. And I've written a couple of blog posts about static sites and GitHub Pages and GitHub Actions, which is pretty cool too. But I think those are both really great static site hosters, is Netlify and GitHub Pages. Man, hopefully I'm ready for it. Hopefully the coffee has fully kicked in. So, it's rough. So it was 4th of July in the US. And so we had a ton of fireworks, and the fireworks were going until 2 a.m. So I went to bed at a little early so I could be up early for the talk, and I didn't get any sleep anyway because of all the fireworks.
Yeah, and another question is what I really love about Gatsby, and maybe it's Gatsby use case, but that you can just put some YAML files in your directory and then GraphQL to query these so this is something I really like, and I think you don't want to copy Gatsby with Flask Frozen, but something like this
definitely not. I'm still a little kind of bummed out about the state of GraphQL in Python. Like it's getting there. It's better. It's better than when I was messing around with Gatsby like 2 or 3 years ago. But it's still nowhere near, like, I think the level of the JavaScript community definitely, I think, is the place to go if you want to mess with GraphQL. And I'd love to see more support from the Python side, because I'd love to do more static kind of GraphQL Python work. And there are a lot of other static site generators that I think are a little more mature in terms of the Python ecosystem as well, things like Pelican and stuff like that. But yeah, it feels like a lot of these static site generators kind of live in the JavaScript world. I'm just a Python developer, so I'm like trying to find like my way of like getting, the architectural benefits while also still like being able to write Python, because I like my, my white space enforcement and things like that. So. Hans, do you have anything from the Discord for us?
Yes, actually, we have a question from Discord. Have you ever turned an existing dynamic Flask app to static with Frozen Flask using Frozen Flask URL generators?
So the original adulting.dev website was kind of a plain app website. I haven't done anything with dynamic URL generation. I would need to go take a look at the Flask documentation or the Flask Frozen documentation to see if that's possible. But my gut feeling is that it's going to be a maybe. So like if you do, I guess it depends on what you mean by dynamic URL generation. So if the URL is being generated by your content provider, then you should theoretically be able to do it when you hit it and you're like, okay, what are the routes that you want me to make available? Cool, I'll make these routes available and I'll route through it in the list. If it's like dynamic route generation because of something that a user is doing on their end, and maybe you're creating like a custom user page or something like that, that probably is the point where you're not going to be able to use Flask Frozen and you're going to want a more traditional Flask website, or you're going to want to have that handled by like some sort of third-party service, and so you just have like a plain user page, and that plain user page hits a Lambda or a serverless function to get like whatever data about the user and then generate it that way. The kind of thought logic that goes into building like one of these dynamic static sites is a little different than building a traditional dynamic site, because largely the dynamic data doesn't live within the code base that you're creating, if that makes sense. That dynamic data lives within kind of other code spheres that you're interacting with on the browser end, or the build server to kind of create those pages. Hopefully that makes sense.
We have Abhishek Mishra saying nice talk.
Thanks, Abhishek. Yeah, and if anyone has any questions after the fact, you're more than welcome to shoot me a tweet as well. I'm happy to respond on Twitter.